Hey guys, Brockshot here. Back with you with the next video in our series, Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Without further ado, returning to Great Expectations. There's one thing you may be sure of, Pip, said Joe, after some rumination. Namely, that lies is lies. However they come, they didn't ought to come, and they come from the father of lies, and work round to the same. Don't you tell no more of 'em, Pip. That ain't the way to get out of being common, old chap. And as to being common, I don't make it out at all clear. You are uncommon in some things. You are uncommon small, like you are uncommon scholar. No, I'm ignorant and backward, Joe. Why, see what a letter you wrote last night. Wrote in print even. I've seen letters. Ah, and from gentle folks that I'll swear weren't wrote in print, said Joe. I've learnt next to nothing, Joe. You think much of me. It's only that. Well, Pip, said Joe, be it so or be it so'n't, you must be a common scholar before you can be an uncommon one. I should hope. The king upon his throne, this crown upon his head, can't sit and write his acts of parliament in print without having begun, when he were an unpromoted prince, with the alphabet. Ah, added Joe, with a shake of the head that was full of meaning. And begun at A too, and worked his way to Z. And I know what that is to do, though I can't say I've exactly done it. There was some hope in this piece of wisdom, and it rather encouraged me. Whether common ones as to callings and earnings, pursued Joe reflectively, might not be the better of continuing for a keep company with common ones, instead of going out to play with the uncommon ones. Which reminds me to hope that there were a flag, perhaps. No, Joe, I'm sorry there weren't a flag, Pip. Whether that might be or might not be, this is a thing as can't be looked into now, without putting your sister on the rampage, and that's a thing not to be thought of as being done intentional. Looky here, Pip, at what is said to you by a true friend, which this to you the true friend say, if you can't get to be uncommon through going straight, you'll never get to do it through going crooked. So don't tell me no more on 'em, Pip, and live well and die happy. You're not angry with me, Joe? No, old chap. But bearing in mind that them which were, I mean to say, of a stunning and audacious sort, alluding to them which border on veal cutlets and dog fighting, a sincere well-wisher would advise, Pip, their being dropped into your meditations when you go upstairs to bed. That's all, old chap, and don't never do it no more. When I got up to my little room and said my prayers, I did not forget Joe's recommendation, and yet my young mind was in that disturbed and unthankful state that I thought long after I laid me down, how common Estella would consider Joe a mere blacksmith, how thick his boots and how coarse his hands. I thought how Joe and my sister were then sitting in the kitchen, and how I had come up to bed from the kitchen, and how Miss Havisham and Estella never sat in a kitchen, but were far above the level of such common doings. I fell asleep, recalling what I used to do when I was at Miss Havisham's, as though I had been there weeks or months instead of hours, and as though it were quite an old subject of remembrance, instead of one that had arisen only that day. That was a memorable day to me, for it made great changes in me. But it is the same with any life. Imagine one selected day struck out of it, and think how different its course would have been. Pause you who read this, and think for a moment of the long chain of iron or gold, of thorns or flowers, that would never have bound you, but for the formation of the first link on one memorable day. Chapter 10. The felicitous idea occurred to me a morning or two later when I woke up. That the best step I could take towards making myself uncommon was to get out of Biddy everything she knew. In pursuance of this luminous conception, as I mentioned to Biddy, when I went to Mr. Wopsle's great aunt's that night, that I had a particular reason for wishing to get on in life, and that I should feel very much obliged to her if she would impart all her learning to me. Biddy, who was the most obliging of girls, immediately said she would, and indeed began to cry out her promise within 5 minutes. The educational scheme of course established by Mr. Wopsle's great aunt may be resolved into the following synopsis. The pupils ate apples and put straws down one another's backs until Mr. Wopsle's great aunt collected her energies and made an indiscriminate totter at them with a birch rod. After receiving with every mark of derision, the pupils formed in line and buzzingly passed a ragged book from hand to hand. The book had an alphabet in it, some figures and tables, and a little spelling, that is to say, it had had once. As soon as this volume began to circulate, Mr. Wopsle's great aunt fell into a state of coma, arising either from sleep or a rheumatic paroxysm. The pupils then entered among themselves upon a competitive examination on the subject of boots, with the view of ascertaining who could tread the hardest upon those toes. This mental exercise had lasted until Biddy made a rush at them, and distributed 3 defaced Bibles, shaped as if they had been unskilfully cut off the chump end of something, more illegibly printed at the best than any curiosities of literature I have since met with, speckled all over with iron mold, and having various specimens of the insect world smashed between their leaves. This part of the course was usually lightened by several single combatants between Biddy and refractory students. When the fights were over, Biddy gave out the number of a page, and then we all read aloud what we could, or what we couldn't, in a frightful chorus. Biddy leading with a high, shrill, monotonous voice, and none of us having the least notion of, or reverence for, what we were reading about, when did this horrible din had lasted. A certain time, it mechanically awoke Mr. Wopsle's great aunt, who staggered at a boy fortuitously, and pulled his ears. This was understood to terminate the course for the evening, and we emerged into the air with shrieks of intellectual victory. It is fair to remark that there was no prohibition against any pupil's entertaining himself with the slate or even with the ink when there was any, but that it was not easy to pursue that branch of study in the winter season, on account of the little general shop in which the classes were holden, and which was also Mr. Wopsle's great aunt's sitting room and bedchamber, being but faintly illuminated through the agency of one low-spirited dip candle and no snuffers. It appeared to me that it would take time to become uncommon under these circumstances. Nevertheless, I resolved to try it, and that very evening Biddy entered on our special agreement, by imparting some information from her little catalogue of prices, under the head of moist sugar, and lending me, to copy at home, a large Old English D, which she had imitated from the heading of some newspaper, and which I supposed, until she told me what it was, to be a design for a buckle. Of course, there was a public house in the village, and of course Joe liked sometimes to smoke his pipe there. I had received strict orders from my sister to call for him at the Three Jolly Bargemen that evening on my way from school, and bring him home at my peril. To the Three Jolly Bargemen, therefore, I directed my steps. There was a bar at the Jolly Bargemen, with some alarmingly long chalk scores in it, on the wall at the side of the door, which seemed to me to be never paid off. They had been there ever since I could remember, and had grown more than I had. But there was a quantity of chalk about our country, and perhaps the people neglected no opportunity of turning it to account. It being Saturday night, I found the landlord looking rather grimly at these records, but as my business was with Joe and not with him, I merely wished him good evening, and passed into the common room at the end of the passage, where there was a bright, large kitchen fire, and where Joe was smoking his pipe in company with Mr. Wopsle and a stranger. Joe greeted me as usual with "Holla, Pip, old chap," and the moment he said that, the stranger turned his head and looked at me. As usual, we'll go ahead and stop there for this week. I want to say thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, and subscribe, as it greatly helps the channel. Light be with you all. Take care, and thanks again.